What was the very first science fiction story? I think I have the answer, but before we get there, let me explain what inspired me to make this video. I was reading an article the other day. Well, actually it was a blog post. Are they the same thing? Who knows? Who cares? Believe it or not, it stated that Neuromancer had a valid claim to the title of the first true science fiction story because it's the genesis of a vision of humanity's digital future. I think the concept is that the definition of science fiction is always shifting as we move through time, so that everything that went before will become a different genre, and true science fiction must always reflect the actual future from our perspective, or something like that. Yeah, the whole thing smells a little bit too murky, to be honest, and it goes against my natural instinct to tear down the gates of genre. It was a terrible article, a blog post. However, I do think it's an interesting thought experiment, something to play around with, especially if you get really hammered first. Think of it this way: what other books could possibly qualify as the first sci-fi story, or seminal, formative, pioneering works as we go back through history on our way to the one true first sci-fi story? How about Dune, 1965. It's the best-selling science fiction book of all time, and if you were to take a survey, which we did twice, it is easily the most popular, the collective favourite science fiction book of all time. For many readers, it's a crossover novel, a gateway drug, mixing pseudo-fantasy elements with politics, religion. It talks about the human condition. It pulls in people from other genres that weren't necessarily looking for spaceships and robots. But let's be honest, that's just the story of Dune's success. I agree that it's a landmark in science fiction. Things were never the same again, but I can't ignore everything that came before 1965. So, onward! Well, backwards onward! I'm pausing in 1897 because I believe War of the Worlds is the most famous science fiction book ever written. Probably. The book does okay all by itself, but the Orson Welles narrated radio play in 1938 really helped, as did Jeff Wayne's musical album, which I'm not allowed to sample on this video because some fat guy in a suit said that I have to pay them. The chances of anything coming from Mars are 1,000,000 to 1, they said. The chances of anything. It may not be the very first book that mentions alien invasion, life on Mars and spaceships, but it is credited with originating certain science fiction tropes. But there is one book above all others that gets the lion's share of the credit for being the first science fiction story. Mary Shelley's 1818 masterpiece was born out of Greek mythology and epic English poetry. The modern Prometheus part of the title is a parallel allegory about creating humans in the image of the gods. Frankenstein has been labelled gothic, horror, even romantic. It's a bit of a hodgepodge of genre, a little bit like a reflection of the monster himself. That's really clever. It's also become the de facto first proper science fiction novel ever written. Whatever the hell that means. It was actually the science fiction writer Brian Aldiss who pointed out that Victor Frankenstein purposefully uses ambiguous but fictional scientific methods to achieve something fantastical, creating life. Whatever your opinion is, this debate will always come down to definition and interpretation, and how much you've been drinking. We can't even agree on what science fiction actually is, so the origins will always be shrouded in mist. However, there is one very old kid on the block that undoubtedly tells a fictional tale about moon people, advanced technology, and interplanetary war. A true story. That's the name of the story. It's not actually true. Can we double check that, please? I don't want to look like an idiot. It was written by a fella called Lucian of Samosata in ancient Syria about 2,000 years ago. 2,000 years ago. That's like 10 Frankensteins ago. I read this the other day, and I want to make the point that this isn't some hipster choice. This isn't classified as science fiction on a technicality. This is the real deal. It starts off like a typical, maybe Greek Odyssey, voyage of discovery tale. A ship is sailing the Mediterranean and it gets blown off course in a storm, and they find an island. It's very dreamy, it's very fantasy. There are some people made out of trees, I think, and they turn some of the crew into tree people, and then the ship gets sucked up into space. So now it's fantasy with a little bit of science fiction, a sci-fi fantasy hybrid. You could call it sci-fantasy. We end up on the moon, where there are some humans living there that were once banished from Earth, so that's very science fiction, but there's still a lot of naked men riding giant frogs type imagery. So there is a lunar colony and we have travelled through space, but it doesn't really surprise me that the traditional human stories made that leap and just stretched the geography to include the big ball of rock hanging in the sky. Even 2,000 years ago, that feels kind of logical. What I didn't expect was the lunar people also want to colonize Venus, but they are blocked by an alien race that come from the sun, and then they have an interplanetary war. To cut a short story even shorter, the conflict is resolved and the narrator gets taken to the base inside the sun, the alien base inside the sun, and part of the truce even talks about the wider universe. Now, I'm not even sure what real science was aware of back then. Even at this point in the book, I'm very impressed with the level of science fiction that we're seeing, but the core of the story is still a traditional conflict, and all we're really doing is using planets and moons instead of nations, and moon people and aliens instead of Romans and Trojans or whatever. But then in the middle of the book we get a glimpse of some super advanced technology. There's no other way to describe it. There seems to be a listening device on the moon where you can witness conversations going on back on Earth, and even not necessarily a headset but some sort of virtual reality device where you can be somewhere else in real time. That's pretty advanced. And then there's a town full of flying, floating lamps that are individually assigned to certain people, like a drone, like a robot proxy. That is a drone, isn't it? There's even a chapter where a whale has TARDIS-like properties. It's much bigger on the inside than it is on the outside, and it holds an entire civilization. It reminds me of the Book of the New Sun, where there is clearly advanced technology on display, but the narrator either doesn't understand it or it's not important enough to the story for them to describe it. So we're kind of left in the dark about what's really happening. I also read a couple of essays about Lucian's writing, and a case can be made that a true story is a satire of the times. It's a reflection of what the people thought about the Roman Empire, and there's even explanations about the sentient lamps and the TARDIS whale. But isn't almost every single science fiction book that we read operating on another level? Certainly Neuromancer, Dune, The War of the Worlds and Frankenstein are more than the sum of their parts. And if you require a fictional extrapolation of our current understanding of science to qualify as science fiction, quite literally, then I would argue that a true story delivers that more than most. Regardless of how impressed I am, I can't give the title of the first science fiction story to Lucian of Samosata, because my definition of science fiction only requires the mind to go beyond reality and have no goblins on horseback. I have standards, and by that definition, the first sci-fi story will never ever be known to us. It was likely the first time somebody sat around a fire and told a yarn. Beyond the tribe, beyond the forest, looking up at the stars in wonder. What if somebody lives there? What if we could one day go there? What if?